As many of you may know, Jones Day started back in 1893 in this city. We now have 2,600 lawyers throughout the world at over 40 offices, but our roots here are still deep. This is home for us, and civic engagement has long been part of our law firm. Today is the second in the Jones Days panel series, which also continues tomorrow and Wednesday. The false narrative in urban economic development has created a public policy that views citizens who live in our lives as liabilities to be managed rather than latent assets to be released and grown, and ignores the human spirit that is inside each one of us. That false narrative has to change. We need a different way. The good news is that urban problems are man-made. They can be solved. We're not trying to grow mountains in Ohio. We need more of the men and women of accomplishment in this nation to step up and lead and to solve problems based on fact, reason, good judgment, and practicality. Quite frankly, we need more adults again and fewer children. Accomplished leaders know what works, know how hard it is to succeed, and ignore the false narratives. They understand the human spirit. That is really why I'm so excited about today. Look at the people on our panels. Dan Gilbert, who besides building a massive financial services company and almost single-handedly rebuilding downtown Detroit into a gem, has done the impossible. He has brought a championship to Cleveland. Beth Mooney, Chairman and CEO running one of the largest financial institutions in the United States, and for the third straight year being named the most powerful woman in banking. Kevin Orr, my friend, as emergency financial manager of Detroit, managed the city to an enormously successful conclusion, resulting in the largest restructuring of a city ever in the world, and is one of the great partners in this law firm. And our keynote speaker, Congressman Huizenga, a young rock star, elected 7 years ago at a very young age, and a rising star in the Republican Party and in the Congress. I just love it. So without any more of me, let me hand it over to the Bloomberg folks who will get this going, because we want to really hear what everyone has to say. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Halpern. This is John Heilman. And we're going to do our best to stay out of the way here so you can hear from interesting people. Just talk a little bit about the context of where we are today, both home and abroad. This is about as uncertain a time as I remember in my career of people concerned not just about the long-term trends in this country and around the world, and at home, first and foremost, people's pessimism about how their kids will do compared to how they'll do, but the declining in household income, stagnate for some, declining for others. Home ownership issues, college affordability. There's long-term problems. But then, of course, in the immediate short term, the unrest we've seen here and abroad in the last year is unsettling to so many people. And so the challenge for leadership is, how do you deal with the short-term crises and continue to address the longer-term trends, particularly since sometimes those two things are in conflict in terms of what the policies will be.
Yeah, I'd just add that, there's no, thank you everybody for being here today. There's no doubt that what Mark just said was true about the, I think, unprecedented, at least in our lifetimes covering politics, which now goes back to the late 1980s. I've never seen an environment that's this volatile, that's this emotionally charged. But I've also never seen a campaign in which there has been less focus on the kind of thing we're going to talk about here today than this one. It's frustrating, I think, even for people in a group like this who are very high-powered and really intelligent and focused on policy. It's frustrating when you see a campaign playing out like this and want to see these issues addressed. I don't know what can happen between now and November, but I do know that if we're going to have a conversation about anything that resembles issues, it's going to require people like this in this room to exercise every point of leverage that you have, every place where you intersect with these campaigns or intersect with the political parties, to try to force them to try to raise their game and raise the level of their conversation so that it meets this moment, because the moment is quite disconcerting for a lot of people, and it's really important that we have a conversation that's more than just Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton calling each other names, which has pretty much been what the campaign has been so far. So, without further ado, Let's bring up Congressman Huizenga. You hear two different stories about America's cities. One story you hear is that the cities are in crisis, terrible, unemployment, lack of opportunity, et cetera. And then you look around and you hear another story, which is that they're in resurgence. You look at Detroit, you look at Cleveland, you look at other places, unemployment rates relatively low, even by the national standard. So what's the story? Are cities in crisis, or are they in a state of renaissance?
Both. I really do think they're in both, but it's in pockets, right? You know, there are certain things that you can very easily identify. You know, trying to recapture that downtown feel, right? And certainly Dan's done that in Detroit. You know, it looks like that's been happening here in Cleveland. I know in our area in Grand Rapids, Michigan, same thing. It took some individual families and individuals who said, you know what, not on my watch. I'm not going to let this happen. They invested heavily into it, yeah, and they just sort of through force of will and frankly oftentimes big pocketbooks have really changed it. Now now that ripple has got to keep moving out.
So to your expertise in the area that you're most focused on, right, was financial services. So in terms of access to capital, in terms of investment in cities, what's one, just pick one, policy change that you would, if you could wave a magic wand and do one thing at the level of federal policy, where you sit, what would that be? In order to increase access to capital, investment in cities, and particularly in inner cities where there's not that much investment, or not enough.
Well, this is very broad, very far-reaching, and people have a tough time maybe always making these connections. One of the things I do is I oversee the Federal Reserve, all right? Monetary Policy and Trade Subcommittee has oversight of the Federal Reserve. The Fed has really become sort of a two-headed beast. One is its independent monetary policy side. The other is it has become a super regulator. And one of those they do better than the other, and I don't think it's the regulator part. And some have questioned where they're going on the monetary policy side. So in overall, I think for that opportunity, it's backing down on some of those regulations where you've got conflicting regulators coming in and telling bankers oftentimes what they should be doing, and then they kind of turn around and go, well, wait a minute, the guys here last week said we couldn't do that. It seems like if we could streamline this and actually get people on the same page on the regulatory side, that would be huge to then allow that capital to be unleashed for entrepreneurs and risk takers, not to take undue risk and not to put the financial services system as a whole at risk. You've got to have risk, though, as a regulator to bad decisions and good decisions. Reward those good decisions, allow the risk to play out on those bad decisions, and not have the federal government come in and bail it out every time.
Thank you three for joining us. Appreciate it. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground. I just want to start optimistically and start with the two Clevelanders, and then Kevin can weigh in as well. Tell me something that's happened in Cleveland in the last 5 years that you think is unique, distinctive, and hopeful, not just for Cleveland, but for all cities. That's something that can work.
Are you looking at me? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you know, this is 52 years. I mean, you know, last 52 years is the first time we won a championship. Now, you know, sports, maybe it shouldn't be as sort of important as it is if you really sort of take a step back and look at it, but it really is for this city. I mean, we saw this in the parade when you look in the eyes of, you know, 1 million plus people who really like feel like a burden lifted. But you know, that is just sort of a feel-good thing, but it you know, how people feel about things as far as confidence and as far as their belief in the future makes a big difference in how they're going to invest. And I think that uncertainty is the sort of the enemy of investment. And when you have something like this happen, and look, you know, the economy of downtown Cleveland, we got here 11 years ago. It's like night and day. When we got here, one of the things I noticed, and it's sort of neat when you come into a city you have absolutely zero history with or anything, and you think you're more unbiased, right? And you probably are. But you know, I looked around downtown. I said, look at these beautiful buildings, but you know, what happened to the people? There's no people here. Now there's so many people. It doesn't matter when you get here. You're flying here. You get here any time of day. There's just young people. My understanding is that they've got something like 99% to 100% occupancy in residential. So there's all this new confidence in downtown, and you're seeing this in downtowns everywhere, Cleveland, Detroit, and other places, just because this generation wants to be an urban core. So I think that's if you were to ask me, one of the better things, Cleveland is riding a wave that other cities maybe are as well, but it's still very, very big here, and it's very strong here.
Yep. Beth Mooney of KeyCorp, tell us something that you've seen that makes you optimistic.
I would echo some of what Dan is saying, which is I think Cleveland didn't win the lottery or win a championship, in the words of LeBron, without a lot of hard work. And what I think you see is a real effort by public-private partnerships, the business community, the civic community, to really say that downtown is a neighborhood, a city needs a strong urban core, and it won't happen if we don't come together and find ways to finance it, to envision it, to build it. And I, too, came here a little over 10 years ago, and it is true. This was a city that was more buildings than people, and I think the area had what I called a collective inferiority complex. But we have a legacy from our Senator Weinberger, who just passed, and the leaders we have in place now, to say this is our town and we can do it. And I think as you look around and see what you have, this is a city on the comeback in many, many ways. And it's through hard work, it's through collaboration, it's through partnerships, and it's the public and private coming together and agreeing on priorities and making them happen. And it's an exciting time to be in a city like Cleveland, Ohio.
Let me ask you a big macroeconomic question that also has a political dimension in the context of this campaign. We're talking about Cleveland, we talked a little about Detroit. These are all cities that have been referred to for a long time as the Rust Belt. There are cities that have had big declines in manufacturing employment over the course of the last 25, 30 years. Hillary Clinton says, those manufacturing jobs not coming back. We got to train people up, get them set for a service economy and the new world. Donald Trump says, this is a disaster. We got to fix it. We got to bring the manufacturing jobs back to revive the Rust Belt. Who's right about the analysis of what's happened and what can happen going forward?
You know, again, I think nothing's ever that simple. It's on the one hand and on the other hand, because 20% of this region's economy is still in manufacturing. And there are over, in our portfolio, being a bank headquartered here in Cleveland, Ohio, we have numerous middle market companies who are in manufacturing, and advanced manufacturing, skilled manufacturing, manufacturing based in technological abilities, the use of chemicals. I mean, there has been a huge growth in manufacturing jobs in this area, but they are of a different skill set. And so what I see is a transitioning, and some piece of it's not just the Rust Belt. I think some piece of it reflects productivity and technology gains that are happening in manufacturing. And then you have a positive arbitrage now with energy costs. So what we see is people starting to, manufacturing actually at some core level has been doing well in this region. And I think the bigger issue is back to the skills gap and the importance of we got to invest in people and education and training. Is if you talk to our client base, they will tell you they can't hire enough workers with the skills or the willingness to do the kinds of jobs that the new manufacturing is. So I think there is a certain kind of job that's gone away. But maybe that's more a function of a global economy and a change in productivity and how work gets done.
Kevin, sorry, just let me bring this question to you. I mean, it is the case. Manufacturing output's still higher than ever, and yet there are way fewer jobs. There's more productivity. And some people would say, that's a great thing. We have a more productive manufacturing sector than we've ever had before, but there has been this job loss. So how do you square that circle in a way that works for the cities, not just in the Rust Belt, but across the country?
Beth took the words right out of my mouth, transitional. I mean, for years, we thought the post-war model, 1950s and before, 30 years and out, heavy manufacturing, relatively unskilled. You could graduate high school, do 30 years, retire at 50, and you'd have a pension and health care for the rest of your life. That model may or may not be there, but transitioning to a more efficient and skilled manufacturing workforce is the challenge we have to meet. And to have people prepared and eligible to participate in that skilled market is a challenge we have to have. You know, I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about the cost of a four-year education to become an English teacher, and you're going to spend $200,000, and you're going to end up making $60,000 out. Well, a telephone line person can make $150,000 after a 2-year skilled trade and an apprenticeship with the IBEW. In addition, they can do overtime when the ice storms come and the power lines come down. So over 10 years, you make $60,000 or $600,000, or you make $150,000 and $1.5 million. To be prepared to transition to a new economy for people who previously could rely on a certain set of skills and a job that was going to be there. For most of my lifetime, we're 5% of the world's population. We're 25% of its GDP. We're a $7.8 billion country, world, right? The other 95% of the world is coming online, and they want the same thing: jobs, market economy, protein. The metrics just aren't there to continue to assume that we can maintain that post-war model.
My sense is there have not been enough basketball metaphors here, so let me do this as a jump ball question to any of you who want to answer it. Education. We've gone in a relatively short period of time. Beth mentioned how important it is, and obviously it is for cities. From George W. Bush, No Child Left Behind, a bigger role for Washington in education, to now every Republican who ran for president talked about getting rid of Common Core, and most emotional, biggest applause line for almost any issue I heard all cycle. So where do you all think the consensus is for what Washington's role should be in education, and where should it actually be in your view?
The federal government spends less than 8% of the education dollars around this nation. It has a very small involvement in education. Education is a covenant between municipalities and their citizens. We have focused on what the core should be and what the standards should be. We have not focused on what that covenant should be to prepare children to learn. Early childhood development has shown a greater yield in terms of what you can do to get that child at an early age that spans out over the years more than anything else. How do we roll that out into the communities? Washington has very little ability to effectuate education on a regular basis. The states do. Talk about states' rights. The states do on that basis. Now, should there be some umbrella organization or discussion about what the goal should be? I firmly believe there should, but there needs to be a broader discussion about urban policy in the educational space and what we're trying to achieve, especially with early childhood development. That's the gift that keeps on giving.
I would weigh in and say, again, an example in Cleveland is the urban core is critical to our success, and we can't all thrive unless we can get an educated population in our urban core. And another example of a public-private partnership was we all rallied around what they call the Cleveland Plan, which was support an increase in taxes that passed, and the business community as well as the government coming together and saying we can't be indifferent about the skills and the ability to graduate. I agree that there's also an early childhood initiative, but you've got a continuum that you also have to get a set of people through school with a GED or high school equivalent and get them the skills to work, and that if we don't address this education thing in a public-private partnership, in Cleveland, I think, was the leader in the state. We had the support of the governor, and the unions, the teacher unions came together and said, you know, we've got to put our kids first and we've got to get them through high school. That is the beginning, and the statistics that show if you don't have a high school degree, that is the really demarcation for lack of skills and self-sufficiency down the road.
So Congressman Heisinger, when I asked about Renaissance versus crisis, made the point that there's pockets, there's differences in the cities, right? It seems to me, though, over the past 25, 30 years of how cities have developed, is that if you think about welfare reform and all the other things that have happened around the cities, one of the biggest problems still remains to be transportation, right? Where there's a giant mismatch between the truly disadvantaged in a lot of cities and where the jobs are. So if you agree with that, that's a problem for a lot of big cities, how do we solve that problem? Kevin, start with you.
Sure. I think when I was in Detroit in 2013, they did a survey of 1,600 municipal managers, and they asked what was the #1 thing that was important for successful management. They said regionalization. And when it comes to transportation space, I'll just take Detroit as an example. If you have 60% of the people in the city who do not drive, can't drive, rely on public transportation, if you don't roll 228 buses out of the depot every morning, including in winter, that means that schedule is going to be late for the day. Two things happen. One, our school children in Detroit take the buses to school. Two, our workers, the majority of them take, so they're going to be late. If they're an hourly worker, they're going to get docked. That has a real impact on their quality of life, but also be able to make rent, groceries, so on and so forth. Also for the school children, if that child misses that bus, they're out in November when the sun's going down at 4 o'clock by themselves in the cold, in the dark. That's unacceptable. Transportation has a huge responsibility, getting people to work on time, getting people to have education on time, allowing people to feel comfortable that their children go back and forth while they're on work. But regionalization, allowing, for instance, move these structural impediments. In Detroit City Code, for instance, RTA, the Regional Transit Authority, cannot pick up riders at city bus stops. That's protectionism. You've got to cut that kind of thing out and have regional cooperation to make sure that the transportation system works in a way that makes sense.
I mean, that kind of, like, when I hear stuff like that, it just really makes me upset. Like,
Yeah.
we have a word for it we use. We call it bureau clownish behavior, or you can be a bureau clown or whatever it might be. But, you know, these kinds of just irrational rules that are absolutely killer for the very citizens people pay taxes, you know, to get these things done, and are in their own self-interest. I mean, there's got to be an intolerance, whether you're Democrat, Republican.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes there's outrage in our society about things that maybe there shouldn't be, but there's not enough over these kinds of things. Maybe people don't understand them, but the kind of rules when you look at education or transportation, it's not a lack of money. It really isn't. I don't think it's a lack of money. I think just a lack of will to challenge these kinds of crazy things that go on.
But there's some question about money, right? And I mean, there's some amount of infrastructure that just doesn't exist, especially transportation infrastructure. So Beth, where does that money come from? State budgets are strapped everywhere around the country. The federal government doesn't generally invest in urban transportation. So how does that problem get solved? Again, to the extent that there are really poor people and there are jobs, but they can't get from where they are to where the jobs are at.
Well, again, I think when you look at the infrastructure of a city, it is critical, and in this area of the world, it is the history of the automobile and buses. It isn't a vibrant train system. So you do have to have the ability to support your regional transit and your city transit in order to facilitate it and have a working bus system. And again, that does come from, some of it comes from the state because there are some funds for the state, but that's largely incumbent on the city to provide that. And it is a core issue of, like you say, having your citizens prepared for work, getting them to work, and creating that self-sufficiency.
And it is the federal government does fund the majority of federal or of urban transportation systems. I mean, they've done it forever in this country. So a lot of the cities don't have their act together, like
Right.
Detroit didn't. In fact, Detroit, I think, went in 21 times over the last 80 years, and they almost, you know, everybody laughs at them. And there's finally, a lot of it due to what Kevin's work was, but getting our act together to go in and get that kind of funding. So, you know, to me, that would be probably the only role in transportation that federal government probably comes to a true regional transportation system, either to finance it, you know, or guarantee the bonds or whatever, or get involved. But it is important. I mean,
Yeah.
anytime you have movement of people and movement of data, good things happen around it.
Is that something, in your experience, that happens naturally, that the wealth starts to spread around, or does government and business need to do things to make sure that as the city comes back, the people who are already there, who are less fortunate, doing less well, are able to share in the success?
It is something where public policy, as well as a business community, needs to come together and make sure that capital is flowing to places where the investment isn't natural. And again, I think it's a responsibility of a bank through how we do our community development lending and investing. I also am here with my hat as the head of our chamber, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, and you know, we have real estate funds that do what I call the mezzanine financing for projects that, but for that level of capital, would not take place. And it is designed to go into parts of the city so we can distribute some of the economic development that will help create demand and create jobs. And so to me, you have to be conscious about that. You have to make choices, you have to have priorities, and you have to have capital to direct to areas. Otherwise, you will have that, your opening statement, are we in crisis or are we thriving? It's both if you don't have public policy dollars and public-private partnership to make sure capital flows to parts of town to create reasons for growth and services and jobs.
Right, Kevin, go ahead.
I would just add something on Beth said, and that's very important, but you also have to look at the structures that allow for equality of opportunity and equality of flow. I mean, we've been struggling with income and wealth distribution since George Washington was the first government contractor along his river farm, right? But you look at a structure in a city that says in order to have a Class A license as a contractor or a demolition expert, you have to have X amount of experience, you have to be licensed, bonded, insured of a certain level, and then you have a Class B, but you can only bid on certain projects. If you don't have it, you don't. If you're a small business and you've never had that experience, never have the capital, you can't get the bonding authority that you need, you will never be eligible to participate in an RFP for a Class A project. That in and of itself is a structural impediment to participation and income redistribution if it's a government project. So you have to look at some of the structures that will allow people to participate at a certain level, which will give them the opportunity to participate better and get a better outcome for income redistribution.
You know,
that's a broader look.
On that point, if I could just add to it, so
Yeah.
like, we get more calls from small business people, both African American and others in Detroit, and say, you know, help me, I can't get anywhere with the city. This after you left. You know, just can't
Glad you're
get
getting
through this
calls.
stuff. You know, and I'm sitting there saying to myself, you know, we still have issues. Now we know how to maybe get around it and have leverage. Now, if we're still having these kinds of sort of crazy challenges at times, imagine what this, you know, small entrepreneurial business person's going through, trying to create wealth and jobs in their city. And you keep hearing the same thread over and over again. There's not enough outrage on the systematic infrastructure that's broke that prevents people from coming up and creating wealth. There's no question.
Jones Day, great to partner on this, and great to see a law firm that's so civically minded. And of course, you two, as successful as you've been in the private sector, the fact that you're so concerned about the public good is really admirable, and we thank you for participating today.
We're going to take that home tonight, and if you need to send LeBron over to pick it up, that'd be great too. We happily host him at our apartment, no big deal. All good.
Congressman, thank you as well, and thank you all for coming as well.
Thank you guys very much.